Joining us now is Representative Dan Banks. He, of course, serves District... Dan Eubanks, I'm sorry.
Hey, it happens to all of us. It is hump day, so we
serves District 25. I hadn't known Dan for about 10, 12 years here. So also Jon Armstrong, Legislative Liaison with the Convention of States, and that's kind of our topic today. Representative Eubanks, thank you so much for coming in, and you too as well, Mr. Armstrong. So the Convention of States, when I saw this on the lineup for today, the first thing I thought about, and I had to go look it up here a minute ago, I remembered writing an article about this that was published in the Clarion Ledger here, the big City of Jackson newspaper. I just looked it up. It was March 2019.
Wow.
And
that was right after we joined the call, probably.
Exactly. It was the day of. The article published the day you guys voted on it. You may remember Lieutenant Colonel Alan West was in attendance.
I do. I've spent the whole day with him.
I had my photo taken.
I think we actually came here and actually did a show in the morning on SuperTalk.
I think that is right. And so the Convention of States, before we discuss exactly what that is, what that means, what we're trying to do here, Mississippi, as I recall, Representative Eubanks signed on to the balanced budget, the fiscal restraint aspect, but not the term limits.
Right. There were three calls basically built into that resolution.
Yep.
And there were a whole lot of folks that was the headwind we were facing in the Mississippi legislature was people didn't want term limits.
Yeah. This would be for members of Congress, by the way.
It'd be for members of Congress, but if you look back at Mississippi's history, we tend to get people and they get in there and they stay there forever.
Certainly, yeah, they do.
and so
both in Jackson and Washington.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. And so in order to basically get that over the finish line and to join the call with the other states around the country, because you have to reach 34 states on a call in order to actually call a convention. The agreement was made that, look, should we get to the point to where we have enough states to have a convention, whatever delegates or representatives we send from Mississippi, they would stay out of the talks on term limits.
Right.
And so we were able to successfully get it passed, and so that was and it's ironic too, because when I went to the simulated convention a few weeks back, I was the chairman of term limits and.
That is very ironic, given that you represent a state that didn't sign on to that part of the effort. And so, John, explain this to us. As I recall, there are some limits in our Constitution about the issues that can be held, and you have to have specific issues. You can't just say, let's have a convention and just remake the country, for example.
Well, the best way to call a convention is to have defined topics. Okay. I don't think there is actually a restriction.
Okay.
But they wanted to do that and keep it, on point. And they had, instead of doing one topic, which has been done before, there have been calls for conventions, and when they do one topic, it doesn't get enough support.
Right.
So this current call for a convention, they decided to combine three very popular ideas: fiscal responsibility, term limits, except for Mississippi, and limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. So those are the three areas that we are calling a convention for. Anything outside of those would not be discussed or, proposed. So that's a way of keeping it contained and safe in a way.
Yeah.
I think currently there's a new thing that the governor of California wants to call an Article 2 convention for gun rights. That's fine. You can do that. But it's probably not going to be very popular, so I doubt he will get much support. These three that Convention of States have chosen are supermajority popular in America with the people.
Okay.
I think it's also important to point out, Gerard, that the hurdle to get there is monumental, but to even ratify it is even more monumental. The process is exactly the same as it currently exists for Congress to propose an amendment. You think back where, we gave women the right to vote, or we made slavery, we got rid of slavery in America. We had amendments that Congress proposed, and it had to go back to all the state legislatures to be ratified. So even if you had something go off the rail, kind of like the naysayers would try to tell you is going to happen, there's still a firewall and a safety check because it's got to go back and pass by 38. I mean,
75%, three quarters.
Yeah.
So I believe it's 2/3 to get the convention underway, and then 3/4 to actually ratify. Is the threshold, which was, I think, wise on the part of our founders.
Oh yeah, you want it to be high.
Yeah.
Otherwise, anybody with a agenda and a whole lot of money might be able to circumvent things. But it was also kind of the Hail Mary. It was the last ditch effort that our founding fathers were wise enough to put into the Constitution to say at some point Congress will get to the place where it is unwilling or unable to regulate itself, where they're unwilling to do the hard thing or the right thing for America, or only act in their own best interest for the next reelection cycle. And at some point, it may be necessary for states to rise up and say, okay, well, we can take the issue into our own hands, and we can follow the same process that Congress follows, and we can propose amendments that limit or at least right the ship.
Sure. So how long has this specific effort been underway? I mean, just with respect to the issues that we're trying to address.
We just had our 10-year anniversary.
Okay.
And it also just got 2,500,000 signatures at about the same time. So it is a slow process, and there's a lot of talk about how long will it take to get to the next stage, which would be calling a convention. No one really knows. I mean, we hope, because there are a number of states that have, say, one house already on board. So we need just the other half. You would think those might not take long. We actually have another state, I forget which one it is. It's ratified, but they have then a bit of legislation that says you can't call a convention of states. So we have it seems unconstitutional. I think it will end up being struck down, and convention of states will hopefully prevail. That would be the 20th state. But it's a slog. It's a long way. I'm hoping it's within the next 3 to 5 years.
Really?
Yeah.
I think the worse that our nation, the worse state our nation gets in, the more people will be aware that, people want to have hope. You want to believe that our best days aren't behind us. And it's hard to have hope when you look at the swamp in D.C. and you see the level of selling out of our country, the unwillingness to actually say, well, you know what, we can't run a $30+ trillion deficit and keep printing money and have $100 to $200 trillion in unfunded, liabilities. At some day, the piper's got to get paid. You can't kick the can forever. And hopefully before that day comes, I think the vast majority of Americans will say, we've got to do something. They're already saying it. And the beautiful thing about an Article 5 convention is it does give hope where there seems to be no hope for the average American, for the states. And I think that it's sad to say it, but the worse the state we get in as a nation, the more relevant an Article 5 convention becomes, because you can't expect the people that are making the rules to rule themselves. Nobody wants to, you've got so many people there that can constitute the swamp in D.C. that have been there for 50, 40, 30 years. They're never going to put limits on themselves. So at some point, it may be necessary for the people in the states to rise up and to right the ship.
Yeah, we're just about at a break, and if you guys can hang around, we'll continue the discussion into the next segment. But I don't have quite as optimistic a view on that. I wrote an article in support of this, so clearly I'm on board with it. And I'd like to think that article, I know it was read a lot by the legislature. I'd like to think that article did have some degree of an influence, that we got at least partially on board with it. I knew the term limits would be a heavy lift. But I have a different take on than you do, Representative Eubanks, on your belief as to why this will become more important, more supported by the electorate. And I'll talk about that on the other side of the break.
Love to hear.
And we'll have that discussion. Coming right back in the Element Wealth studio. Stay with us. We're chatting with Representative Dan Eubanks and also Jon Armstrong, Legislative Liaison for the Convention of States. So you were making the point, and I think it's a valid point, and it's a logical point, that where you really see folks get behind such an effort is when they just look at Congress and say Congress is dysfunctional, it's ineffective, not really advancing the ball here for the betterment of the country, and it's time for us as the people through this Convention of States process to exert some pressure and to get some things done.
Right.
And so I totally agree with that. The concern I have, and it's something we've talked about on the program many times, is that those of us on the right that cherish freedom and believe in free markets and limited government and lower taxes and all that entails, I think we're losing the messaging war in a big way. And if you talk, I think, to the average person out there, they would agree that our $31 trillion of debt and our we're looking at a $2 trillion deficit this year, by the way, this fiscal year, which ends at the end of next month. I think they would say, well, that's because we don't take enough taxes in. And that's a very, very effective point that they make. And leaders in the Democrat Party really pound that drum. I pay a lot of attention to that, and I see reaction from the average person in this narrative that, well, the reason we're running up these huge deficits is because Trump gave tax cuts to his wealthy buddies and corporations. That, I think, is the prevailing attitude in the country. When you start talking about, let's look at the convention, for example, which calls for fiscal restraint, balancing the budget. Right. I think that's a noble cause, and I think it's something that a lot of people could get behind. But here's what's missing. You look at the RNC debate last week, virtually every candidate up there said, we got to stop all the radical spending. Okay, specifically, what do you want to stop? Because they'll say, we can't touch Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Okay, right. You can't do anything about debt interest. Well, that's 70% of outflows. We can't touch the military. In fact, we got to raise that. Well, now we're at 85%. So you're dealing with about 12 to 15%, which is all the rest of government. Well, if you got rid of every bit of that, you still have $1.5 trillion deficit. If you got rid of all the military, all discretionary spending, all the government complex outside of mandatory spending, you still have $1 trillion deficit. That's where we are. So now you're talking about, well, let's go reduce benefits being paid out by Social Security and Medicare. Don't touch that.
Right.
That's why I think this is a problem. We've gotten so upside down and we've kicked this can down the road for so long, nobody will offer any, here are my plans to balance the budget. Here's what that budget looks like. All they say is, we got to cut spending. But nobody said, here's my budget.
Right. Well,
balanced.
But, if you think about it, every family, every individual that's listening right now, they live within a budget. Right. And if they get their hours cut and their budget goes down, they have to go in and triage what's got to get cut.
No doubt.
And so if you limit how much Congress can spend, they're going to go through and they're going to cut out a bunch of stuff. And you're going to have to take a good hard look and triage what's really necessary. I mean, we're already into the Ukraine for $150 billion. We spent hundreds of millions of dollars on all this gender equity, transgender stuff in the last budget that got passed back in November. Billions of dollars on green. There was $100+ million in the budget that got passed back in November that was solely for the purpose of figuring out how to tax Americans for how many miles they drive. Not how much gas they buy, right, but how many miles they drive. At some point, you will have to say, hey, I can't afford the cable anymore. I'm going to cut it. We can't afford to go out and eat every night. We'll cut it because this is what we bring in and this is what we can spend. And the federal government, as long as they have the ability to use the American people as an ATM or the ability to go out and print money whenever they need it, they will never limit themselves. And so I agree with you. I mean, there are core functions of government, and there are obligations that we have as a nation that we have to. I think we do have to take care of the elderly with Social Security. I think we do need a national defense. But at some point, we have to also say, well, of that $800 billion that was set up for our national defense, how much is defending somebody else's border? And we're letting people pour into our border, and how much is that costing the country in unintended expenses, You don't just come into the country and it doesn't cost us on some fiscal level. And so, I mean, yeah, it sounds kind of pie in the sky, but if you can say, no, we are going to the state of Mississippi has a balanced budget.
Right.
And we put so much away each year in a rainy day fund, and we can't borrow more than we retire, and we manage our household a lot better than the federal government by far. And so if we never do anything to constrain, then all we got is business as usual. It's the old adage, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result. If we keep doing business as usual, we will continue to print money at an unbreakable pace, and then the problem is going to be a whole lot more detrimental down the road. And when the dollar ceases to be the world reserve currency, which it's starting to look like that's happening with the BRIC nations and everybody else, we've got to get our house in order. We've got to restore confidence in the dollar, in our nation, and you don't do that by running up more debt.
No, I hear you, and I'm on board with all that. All I'm saying is that I haven't heard a Republican yet that says, yeah, we got to do something about mandatory spending that's running for president. The only person that's really been to any degree vocal about it is Rick Scott.
Yeah.
And to some extent, John Cornyn said a little bit about it. And the senator, his name escapes me right now, from Wisconsin, he said something as well. But, I mean, very tacitly touched on it. Donald Trump said, can't touch it. Okay, well, then we could get rid of the whole rest of government, and we still got a massive deficit. I mean, that's where we are. We still have a $400 billion deficit. If we got rid of the entire Department of Defense, not just cut out the wasteful spending, I mean just no more Defense Department.
But how much of that deficit is made up of a lot of this other garbage that isn't, depends on where people fall on the side of how involved we should be in Ukraine. I personally feel like it should be humanitarian. But we are headed down a road and playing chicken with Chinese and the Russians, and we're leaving our own border wide open, but we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars to the Ukraine. That's part of the deficit.
It's 1%.
Yes.
Is what it amounts to. Where's the other? Where are we going to get the other part of it? I mean, that's the problem.
Well, it's like a small leak can sink a big ship.
It's 8% of the deficit. It's 1% of spending. The math, the way it works out.
Well, we're talking about let's just eliminating the deficit. So 8%. If you keep ratcheting up and finding those things like that, you're going to get to 50. You may not get all the way there, but there's got to be a process. And I know even in the discussions at the simulated convention on that particular call, it always came with a phase-in period, because you can't just cold turkey.
No, you can't.
We're just going to cut it off. You've got to be able to budget. And when we were looking at getting rid of the income tax here in Mississippi, several of the plans that were floated were, even the current one we have is a phase-in, because you don't want to shock the system and not be able to provide.
Just keep in mind, while you're doing that, Social Security and Medicare keep going up.
Yeah.
So you're just plugging one hole and busting out another one.
But you got to be hoping that the economy is also growing and revenues will increase. And we know that the less money you take from people, because the government has nothing to give away. It doesn't first take from somebody else.
Yeah,
that money turns over a dozen times. It's going to get taxed a dozen times. And so revenues will increase. And that's part of the reason why all these states have all these surpluses right now, because all of that stimulus money infused, and it just turned over and turned over and turned over.
I call it helicopter money.
It's going to run out eventually. It'll quit turning around. And then
it's an issue for the state of Mississippi that we need to be concerned about as well. So John, how optimistic? You said 10 years you think you can get sufficient number of states, which would be 34, to get the convention underway.
I'm hoping it's 3 to 5. And I am optimistic. And it's interesting when you're talking about the current Republicans not having answers. Yeah, I agree. They're part of Washington. Washington is broken. Washington broke itself. Washington likes it that way. Convention of States doesn't always have answers, but we want to change the incentives, because Washington's incentive is to get money to move around so we can skim off our part.
Yeah, I agree.
And the Convention of States is going to try and think about this anew and come up with different ways to do it. So that's the part that I find the most optimistic.
Okay. Well, I look forward to this thing getting some legs and getting underway and getting something on the table, and maybe we can make some change.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah. Appreciate it. Representative Dan Eubanks and Jon Armstrong talking about the Convention of States. We're coming right back in the Element Wealth Studio.